Welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this afternoon's webinar session. Please sit back and enjoy today's webinar session where we will discuss the economic impacts of automated vehicles on jobs and investment. This webinar is proudly brought to you by the Australian Driverless Vehicle Initiative, or ADVI, together with the ARB Group and of course MicroPlan Dimasi. Before we move on with the presentation, may I ask for your attention for a few short moments while we cover up a few formalities and housekeeping items. My name is Rosemary Patterson and I'll be co-moderating the session today, providing you with tech support if required. Joining us on this webinar is my esteemed colleague Jerome Carslake, who is Steering Committee member of ADVI. Jerome, for any listeners hearing about ADVI for the first time, would you kindly give us a brief overview?
Certainly, Rosemary, my pleasure. ADVI is basically led and coordinated by ARB. It's a cooperative partnership program comprising of more than 80 Australian and international organisations. It's funded by a range of government, industry and academic research partners, and its role is to accelerate the safe and successful introduction of driverless vehicles onto Australian roads.
Awesome, and thanks for joining us, Jerome. The session is being recorded and the video together with the presentation material will be made available to you on conclusion of the session. For first-time webinar attendees, please see some helpful hints on your screen. Please note the question box in particular, where you will type through questions, comments or feedback for our presenter. Now, speaking of our presenter, please join me in welcoming Brian Haratsis to the microphone. Brian is an economist and strategic planner. His work includes major projects, QV, key sectors, retail, car sales, etc., and strategic economic advice. He has provided economic advice in relation to Plan Melbourne, Darwin Region Plan, Sydney Metropolitan Strategy, and recently published Destructive Cities, which canvasses the introduction of AVs. Welcome, Brian. Awesome to have you in the studio.
Thanks very much, Rosemary.
How are you today?
In fine form, just such a beautiful day in Melbourne.
It is great, isn't it?
It's finally put it on for us, hasn't it?
Awesome. So let's get started. Let's hear what you've got to tell us.
Okay, well, this is a thought piece that really tries to outline how the introduction of AVs might occur in Australia and why. And in doing that, it's seeking to help other people and analysts understand what those issues look like and how we might go about understanding and unpacking. So, firstly, I'm looking at it from an Australian perspective, and then I'm asking the question: why is there an AV revolution? What's driving it? Because unless there's a rationale, but there are lots of reasons why. Firstly, there are very major consumer benefits, and there are some USPs, unique sales propositions, and a good one is freeing up time for people, for example, on congested freeways. And Volvo will freely say this is their primary rationale as to why people might be interested in using and buying an AV initially. There are very important equity issues, and I'll be showing some great slides about how it is that the productivity of individuals, which equates to your income, would be significantly improved if there was better access to employment. And for example, in Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, are great examples of where our public transport definitely doesn't work as well as it ought to in suburban areas. Productivity can be improved significantly, and that's a big issue in the Australian economy. There are several forms of economic efficiency. There can certainly be increased social interaction, although some might say if it's not managed, it'll be social isolation. If AV is used with EV, electronic vehicle, then we could actually have significant reductions in carbon dioxide. And one of the biggest issues is, of course, how do we fund all this, or what happens to tax fuel and tax revenue? And so I've shown that little diagram there, which actually shows, and in fact in Australia, it was in the news this week, Jerome, I don't know if you saw it or not, where people are starting to ask questions about the tax revenue reducing from the fuel excise over time.
So people are beginning to understand the issue. So can you walk us through a little bit? So why is it like the Holden Commodore at 4.5 cents per litre versus the Tesla Play 0?
Well, Teslas, of course, don't use any fossil fuel, so there's no excise on the use of the car. So when we get to a situation where there's 50% EV, electronic vehicle, we halve the amount of fuel excise that the federal government can collect. And whilst that money is not hypothecated to road infrastructure, it's a very important source of revenue, around 15 billion a year, billion.
So I guess the question then will be, how do we maintain our infrastructure?
Well, that's exactly right. So the question I've posed here is fuel versus congestion tax versus new taxation framework. And what my analysis is begging is that actually it's not just about fuel excise. We actually probably need to develop a new tax framework which understands and promotes what I call a new ecology of mobility.
And so AVs could be a bit of an accelerator for that.
Well, AVs would be the trigger for it.
Awesome.
So the starting point for everybody is really that the economic case is underdeveloped. I've had a little bit of an advantage of having been able to not only read widely, but I've had a lot of support from the Policy and Risk Group and from a number of other professionals in the business who have sent me all of the information and all of the links to everything that's been written. And so a lot of the ideas here, of course, aren't just mine, they're from the broader groups. But the starting point is that we really need to understand the demand for mobility in private vehicles, because we need to understand what the implications of the future are. So what would happen if nothing happened? If we just went on today?
Business as usual.
Absolutely. And so I've unpacked that here. Then what I'm saying is we really don't understand, if business as usual didn't occur and we decided to introduce AVs, what would an end point look like? What's the end state? Now the reason for that is an economist actually likes to compare two things, to analyse them and say, well, that's an apple, that's an orange, and the orange is a little on the bitter side, and therefore we think it's got these kinds of benefits or disbenefits. But of course that vision isn't yet unpacked. So I've had to use other methodologies, and I've looked at the methodologies that other people have used, and so today is a summary of what others have done and what I've done, but sharing with you that so far the best research focuses on ride sharing and ride hailing. And here of course we're talking about Uber, and we're talking about GoGet, we're talking about Maven, which is the General Motors version of car rental, $6 an hour in Detroit for a brand new GM motor vehicle. Just swipe your card.
And I'm away.
Yep, and you're away. So so far we're looking at the near future. Some people get very confused about the EV transitions. In other words, an autonomous vehicle, of course, could be petrol, it could be diesel, but it could be electronic. So it's not necessary to be electronic, but actually there are significant benefits in being electric vehicles. So what I've been able to work through is that some of the key problems with the analysis so far is the scope of economic impact. Most of the analysis really focuses on vehicles only, and so for example, economic impacts of directly on vehicles. But as we were discussing, if an EV came along at the right price, then of course there would be significant impacts on household energy with Cube and with other technologies, Tesla Wall. So it's much broader. What are the real infrastructure costs? Well, there are thoughts that, oh, hey, we don't really need to invest anything in our current infrastructure, but we know from ADVI that there are significant investments required to get our current road infrastructure. But not only that, for example, in the future, there would need to be monitoring. And what happens if something goes wrong? I mean, everybody probably read this week that the Westgate Bridge was closed for nearly 3 or 4 hours. It brought Melbourne to its knees. There will be problems with AVs. How is that monitored? Who invents the monitoring system? Who pays for it? And when we think about this, air traffic controller, well, we know how that works, and that's on a national base. So there are real infrastructure costs that haven't been thought through. What's the difference between the short run and the long run? All of the forecasts would tell you that a market-led introduction of AVs in the short run will lead to more cars on the road, and that will lead to more congestion. But in the long run, there could be some very significant benefits. And so, for example, if an automated vehicle in the long run does not have to go back to, can remain on the road, does not go back to base, then there can be very significant reductions in total numbers of motor vehicles on the road. So the time period for analysis is also incredibly important. So there needs to be assumptions about when does the analysis start and when does it actually finish. So, sorry?
So I guess on those sort of two scenarios then, the more cars and less cars, I guess that's where we're looking a bit more of a, I guess, if we're projecting that people remain, the culture stays the same. We're car-centric, we own our own vehicles versus, like you mentioned, the sharing sort of culture. Is that the real differences there?
Well, it's not only that, it is that there would be a future that I'll talk about that you could see where AVs were integrated with public transport. And for mine, that is the way that we should move forward. We should not be letting AVs unfettered on roads, and there are some interesting reasons why. The real estate of the infrastructure is owned by all of us, and there are real possibilities in the future. I'll give you an example where a mobility company could own 100,000 vehicles which never go back to base, which are circulating on the roads every day, and it's free. There's no costing, there's no congestion charges, nothing that sits behind that. How that just doesn't work.
Especially if it's an EV as well.
It's absolutely, and so it's a likely scenario. So there are real reasons why we need to have a better understanding of the structures that sit behind. So some of the things that are important are how consumers really assess the benefits. I mean, what would you be prepared to pay, Jeremy, if you could sit in the traffic every night and you could use the iPad for work, you could watch your favourite show, have your cappuccino, and some people would be prepared to pay a lot for that opportunity.
I catch the bus and the train, so what's a MyKey? $3.80? Yep. I'd be willing to pay that.
Well, that's $1,000 a year, mate. $380. There you go. But look, there are many intangibles, but one of the biggest ones is obviously road deaths and injuries. And just to give you an example, most of the forecasting suggests that around 80% of road deaths could be avoided. I'm a bit more conservative than that. I'm saying around 50%, but there's around 1,200 road deaths this year in Australia alone, 1.2 million around the world. I was looking at US the other day, 36,000, going up to 38,000 this year. If we avoided 50% of the road deaths in Australia, that would be around 600 deaths a year. And just to size that up for everybody, we lost 450 Australians in the Vietnam War. So we would be preventing the equivalent of one Vietnam War every year. What's that worth? What are we prepared to, how do we value that? What are we prepared to pay for that? These are the things that we haven't begun to really think through. So just moving forward, what is the end business model? Is it AV plus public transport plus active transport? Is it inside that model? Is it 100% AV or 100% AV on designated roads? Or is it AV to support PT? And I would suggest that would be the model that you'd really have a big run at, because in Australia, our public transport is not very cost efficient because we've got relatively low densities and off-peak usage is below where it ought to be. Or would it be AV to support a new industry and new jobs? I mean, do we build the AV concept as an industry? As an economist, I would say this is what we should be doing, because we should be manufacturing, we're creating softwares, our own artificial intelligence, hard infrastructure, innovation, congestion charging. And what we should be doing is developing these industries to create new city, regional and new interregional structures. So why is it so? Because in the future, we not only have 4 of the most livable cities in the world, we actually want to retain that tag, and we're not going to retain that tag with the kind of traffic congestion that is forecast by Infrastructure Australia. If we spend $120 billion on infrastructure between now and 2031, their forecast is worse traffic congestion. That's at $120 billion. So there needs to be a significant change agent in the system at the moment.
The other thing is, I think we'll see a lot more of our young people, the brains, will remain in our cities as well.
Absolutely, it's a real talent issue, and in Destructive Cities, I really developed the argument around our cities being the main draw card for internationals to want to live in Australia. It's not the outback anymore, and it's not the beach anymore. It's the fact that we've got safe, cultured, and important cities for the world. So the economic case is wildly underdeveloped, and I take everybody on a little bit of a journey through that, but I'd like to take you down around halfway on this slide where some of the approaches really look at what I call innovation take-up rates. For example, it's called a Bass diffusion model, where we look at the history of take-up of motor vehicles, history of take-up of mobile phones, and then we apply that kind of curve of take-up and say, well, on that basis, the number of people that would take an automated vehicle would follow the same curve. Well, no one's really done forecasts that look like that yet. McKinsey does their forecasting a little bit like that, but my methodology really has looked at the question of scale. So in other words, I've looked at the current industry and the industry size, and being the economist that I am, I've asked the question, well, how many vehicles do we have on the road? Well, passenger vehicles at the moment, and then ask the question, what's the turnover? How many new vehicles per annum do we actually purchase? Therefore, how does the fleet turn over? And therefore, how fast, even if a 100% take-up rate for AVs occurred, how fast could you actually get change? And so my numbers are interestingly more conservative because they're based on, I think, more realistic rates of take-up. Now, this could change if a government mandated something, Jerome, but I'm not. But anyway, so I'm different to the others.
There's no point being the same, Brian.
No, and then this, and I was really concerned to use evidence, and so even the way that I've sized up the benefits to the Australian industry, I've looked at the existing size of the car manufacturing industry and associated industries, and asked the question in relation to the same percentage market share. So unlike other international studies, this I think is quite a realistic view. So just on the next slide, I've looked at vehicle electrification and just made the point here that even if electric vehicles were to become important, and they won't be in this, and it won't in the next 10 years, they will not be important in Australia. It's less than 1% at the moment. It can't get to more than 5% by 2025 on current technologies unless there was some major change in battery pack prices. But I've actually noted that out for everybody to have a bit of a look at. And so if you actually have a look at the electric vehicle sales at the moment, in terms of compound average growth rates, they're high, but the numbers are actually really low, other than for places like Oslo, where EVs are around 25% of the total. So when we look at the timing of EVs, when we look at the cost structures, the key point is that you really need to be doing around about 70,000 miles as current at the moment to really make an EV stack up. And at the bottom, their forecasts say around about 35,000 or 50,000 kilometres a year to really warrant buying an EV to get your money back. And we're just not there at the moment.
I guess we've also got the issue of supporting infrastructure. So the question is, if you're driving around, how do you actually get access to charging? If you're driving to work, for example, where are you going to plug in your vehicle when you get in there? Absolutely,
there are very significant sets of reasons why or barrier. I think I'd probably call them barriers to entry. If you're wealthy and you've got more than one motor vehicle, that barrier often goes away. But or if you're committed to the environment, it can, you value other things more importantly. But that's not what happens in Australia. So when we look at electrification, that's one set of issues. But don't get mixed up between electrification and automated vehicles. They're two separate. I think they're separate issues which may have an interesting economic connection. Perhaps in the short run, this issue of road hailing versus ride sharing is important, and one of the reasons it's important is if you have a look at the research that's been done, McKinsey have proposed in their latest integrated mobility report that ride hailing and ride sharing could be the accelerator. In other words, what would happen is if companies really got into ride hailing or even Uber with automated AVs, they would need to purchase significant numbers of vehicles, which could be electronic vehicles and automated vehicles, which would force the price down. So so they've got an accelerator theory, and I've got some of the graphs in here, but there is no doubt that there is a new ecology of mobility through a sharing economy, and we are just at the start of the sharing economies as things run at the moment. The question is, can ride hailing and sharing increase the scale of the industry and decrease costs in the short run? The answer is no. But maybe by 2020, 2021, things are moving ahead in Australia, but not at the kind of speed that you would need to actually have any impact on price of a vehicle.
No, and we've got a good question here from Monica.
Yep.
And as we said, so if people want to fire questions through, as soon as you do, once we get a nice break, we'll pass them on to Brian and get him to step up to the plate. So what we've got here is, what do you think the effects of AVs are on the upcoming light rail projects in the ACT?
Well, there's been some interest. I think there'll be some interesting impacts. I think it could have a negative impact on ridership if AVs are not integrated with the light rail project. And so this is my starting point, Jerome. As I said to you, that the introduction of AVs should be managed in a way that integrates with public transport, and that would mean congestion charging. So if you buy a level 4 or above AV, you would sign up to a congestion charge, and we would also have significant congestion charges around major employment destinations in peak periods to make sure that public transport is supported. This ought to be the prime objective. And that's as yet. Actually, I haven't seen this argument put in the rest of the world. I think maybe we see it more because our public transport really is so constrained in terms of its distribution.
It's very centralised.
That's right, and very hard to get to, or you've got to use 3 or 4 different modes to actually, to be able to work. Just one important point here: 70% of employment in Melbourne is not centre-based. 70, yeah. So the reason why I'm so confident that AV numbers would increase dramatically and there'd be significant impacts on buses and bus networks and perhaps light rail networks is because people are going to lots of other places other than central Melbourne. We don't have a Parramatta is a good example. So we don't have that binodal situation. So just moving on, there's lots of movement at the moment in terms of example companies. I've showing you some of the companies and what they're actually doing at the moment, and there's a lot of investment being made in ride-hailing companies as we stand at the moment. So you can see some of the investments at the moment in terms of billions. I mean, we're up to $11 billion in 2015, and my intelligence is that we'll be getting to 23 billion in a couple of years. So the big context.
I've got a question here from Ian. We'll just throw straight in, which is a good one. What interaction has there been with local governments to adjust planning for new communities that would host AV? Have any studies been done on how community infrastructure can be adjusted to meet AV vehicles, e.g. number of streets in suburbs, remote communities connected by rail?
Well, the answer is there's been a little bit of work done in the UK, and I could link Ian to that. That's interesting. In Australia, having worked on Plan Melbourne Refresh, the new Sydney plan, I can tell you that there's a couple of paragraphs in Infrastructure Australia's Infrastructure Report for Australia. There are a couple of paragraphs in the Infrastructure Victoria report, a couple in New South Wales. It has not permeated into the metropolitan plans. There are no statutory triggers for it, and I've been pushing very, very hard on the eastern seaboard, at least, where I'm very much involved, to be able to integrate the thinking. One of the interesting issues, and that's why we're having today's webinar, is that the thought process and understanding and the vision of the future is so poorly understood. It is very hard to create policy change when there's a real lack of cred in AV. I mean, people still really don't believe it.
Yeah, I think it's a Jetson situation still.
That's exactly right. And it's only really when I started to work with ADVI and get on the inside of the technology and understood that the technology was not the issue. It's questions like Ian's, and it's really getting a coalition of understanding that we need to make these changes, and we can make some very positive changes right now. One thing I can say to Ian is if you just have a look at my book, Destructive Cities, online, and you'll see I've got a couple of interesting sections, and I've actually shown some plans of today and the future as to how town centres might look, because I think that we won't be basing town centres on shopping centres anymore. There's much more to it than that moving into the future. So thanks for that question. Moving on. So why should Australia be an early adopter? Well, I think that's a pretty easy one. We're fast growing, we're wealthy, we've got exponential traffic congestion, we've got low density and low efficiency mass transit, we've got suburban growth, low appetite for PT investment. Actually, I could go on for a while, couldn't I?
Okay, you'll be busy.
So there's no need to go on with this, but you see, I developed the argument that Australia should be an early adopter, and that is one of the key rationales for me to come to the conclusion that we should have an industry-based approach, not just a transport-based approach to the potential jobs and investment in the sector.
And that's really the goal of AVI, trying to bring everyone together to get a critical mass moving us all forward. And got another question here from Jason. Has there been consideration to a road seal and pavement with AVs? Like, do AVs track exactly the same wheel path, i.e. 300 millimetres off the centre line?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of discussion about this and about what are the standards that may or may not apply. And the answer is the system is driven by each of the individual car companies at the moment as to how they would like to do it and what kind of GIS systems, satellite systems they've got. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should actually have some standards, and I know that we've been trying to work through those things at ADVI, but we should have broadly based standards so that there can be, how can I put it, in the future there can be more consistency and a better understanding of what you're buying and what you actually get. And that question often gets asked too in relation to, do I put the car into happy mode, or do I put it into let's get to work mode, or is there only one mode of driving this vehicle, and how does that work? But I can tell you some of my recent reading is that they've got, at the moment, AI now developing, has now developed how to play poker and actually how to fake a move in poker. So there's enough AI out there to play poker, and I reckon that's what it's like driving in peak hour, Gerard.
Well, I think some of the mapping software which drives you around the place has a bit of sense of humour at times as well, how to get from A to B.
Well, the French lady that I've got's a ripper. So look, there's great opportunity and there's real urgency, because you see, any forecast shows Carmageddon by 2031 in Australia, and I'd invite people to look at the Infrastructure Australia 2015 audit and the 2016 report. And the facts of the matter are, Jerome, we can't fund the future in PT. It's just too expensive for too little benefit. So AV suits us as a technology, and I'd suggest EV suits us as a fuel. I think, though, that we will need to do that really understanding, and the second last dot points, the ecology of mobility to match and support emerging industry structures. So this is small to medium-sized enterprises, the gig economy, which all of us have now got numbers of different jobs, number of different gigs. That's what that's all about. And as a part of these outcomes, we'll definitely need to get to congestion parking and brand new parking regimes for taxation as well. And I think the only way to do this is to use AVs as the trigger, so that we're not talking about penalising or equity problems today. What we're talking about is something new at a point in time in the future with a method of introduction.
We have a parking paper coming out soon, and a good question here from Brian. Other than policy changes, how better can the integration work between the AV and the other modes of the public transport so as to reduce competition?
Well, I think there's a couple of things will happen. Firstly, there will be an increase in mobility, and this is an interesting debate, because if the current forecasts for Australia, the capital city forecast that BITRA have actually done, look at something like a 25% increase in mobility, well, not individual mobility, but total mobility requirement. We're thinking, and other researchers are thinking, that individual mobility will increase as it gets easier to move around and pick up the AV and go to the shops. Now, there are very big issues in this. I mean, a good example would be, is there a policy that you can't drive an AV less than 400 metres? Maybe it's unless you're disabled or whatever. There's got to be all kinds of thought.
Otherwise, the waistlines will be changing somewhat, I dare say.
Well, absolutely, and so there's much more to it. Is it that the mobility economy has now a different government policy framework, so that if you are taking a AV into town, it's not only congestion charging, but actually there's a significant discount if you click onto public transport at a certain point. So, for example, we have actually a significant incentive, and we all know through the Uber technologies now that would be very easy to do that. So it costs you X, bang, and it's nothing. So I think that's a really good question. And these are the kind of things we need to sit down with and really nut out.
I think it illustrates what a disruption we've got coming ahead and how many unknowns there are as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So look, I'm just running through some of the slides. The next slide really just shows that McKinsey, how McKinsey actually classified things, and we are classified as private autonomy, and they think and I think we'll maintain private car dominance, because I don't think there's any other option. And what this shows is the actual and predicted components of passenger kilometres, and it just shows that per person, the current forecast is that we're not going to increase mobility, but you see, I don't think that's right. I think AVs will change that. I think we will be far more mobile. And this is the actual predicted passenger kilometre task. So in Australia, we've got really good reasons. New Zealand is a good example where they've actually had reducing total mobility levels. We're quite unusual by international standards to have such a fast increase in the task.
Based on that slide,
yep.
The options are we either change how we're mobile,
yep.
Otherwise we have to build a whole lot more road infrastructure and transport infrastructure to bridge that gap, correct?
That's exactly right. So for those of you in the northwest of Melbourne, we'll get another 4 lanes on the Tullamarine Freeway, and we'll get another 4 lanes on the Monash, and we've got ourselves into the point now where I think we've even forgotten about demand management, and this is madness moving on in this way. what we see here is that if all things being equal, public transport as a mode share actually dropping off, which amazes me. These are the transport plans. This is BITRA's forecast for Australia. Now, if that's what we know, that's without AVs. Can you imagine what that would look like with AVs? And that question was asked early on. So we actually have a really important set of public policy issues on many different levels that we've got to begin to consider with more, I think, how would I put it, with more urgency. So with Bill Gates, would always overestimate the change in the next 2 years and underestimate the change in 10, and I think we're definitely in there.
And I got a segue. I got a good question here from Rob on that one. I think, will there be a potential impact on employment which will reduce health costs, reduce vehicle repairs, reduce the need for car insurance, reduce the need for professional truck drivers?
Well, the answer to that is yes. There will be some really interesting negatives and some really interesting positives. And just to put that in a little bit of perspective, BMW reported that they were taking on 400 AI, artificial intelligence engineers, if they can find them. If we looked in Australia, there are a significant number of car, not just component manufacturers. We saw this week, and you'll see on Basecamp, those of you that view it, that we now have AV as an aftermarket product in the US for $1,000. So my overall estimate is that for Australia, because we are so small, we have the potential to export to large markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. So I think some of the jobs in Australia will drop out, but they will be replaced by others. And I'll just take the driver. I'm just looking at the latest SkyStar little delivery vehicles, the AV delivery vehicles, got 6 wheels on them, and you actually call them up. They actually deliver up to 40 kgs, and they actually move at pedestrian pace. And so it's not just about automated vehicles for passengers. It's all about localised the last mile delivery and freight. And but that requires a significant people to pick things in shops. That requires people to develop software. That requires people to make those little robots to insure them. So this is my sort of overall estimate is that people will spend more on mobility in total, and therefore there is likely to be more jobs. So I don't take the rise of the robots type argument and sort of say, look, we're all going to be unemployed.
I would also think for truck drivers and other drivers out there, this isn't going to be something that's going to happen overnight. This is still we still need the assurances that it's going to be a safe technology.
Oh, absolutely. I would have thought the insurances had increased. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about whether they increase, decrease, stay the same, and who's actually the responsible party here. But I would think that we'll have to probably get to a no-faults third-party situation, which we all have to pay for, and there will be other forms of insurance that we'll all want in the system. So very, very different. Just looking at our investment as a percentage of primary business investment, in other words, that means non-agricultural. You can see there we just don't spend money on transport infrastructure anymore, and we're not going to. We're just going to sweat what we've currently got. That's the way it's going to move. These kind of graphs, and I'm just going to run through them quickly, show that last graph shows that with increasing congestion, the price of dwellings in inner Perth, inner Melbourne, inner Brisbane, inner Sydney, all increases much faster than the outer suburbs. Why? Because they've got much better public transport and much less congestion to fight. And so moving into the future, the problems that we have got in terms of productivity are that all the non-productive areas you can see in Sydney here, they all become far more productive, not just the eastern suburbs, as you can see, and the same in Victoria, where high productivity correlates with strong educational, cultural and community infrastructure. So there are very big equity reasons why we should be doing this, because it connects. This increase in access to employment is probably the biggest single equity thing that we could achieve out of it. And it's difficult as an economist as you then begin to think about, well, what economic framework do I develop to analyse this, to provide policy advice? Where do you stop? Where do you start? And where do you actually stop? This is my favourite vehicle. I've unfortunately don't own one of those, but Jerome's seen my 63 panel van, and it's a ripper. It's got the sunset on the back, but I just never had enough money to have one of these. But the point here is that the time frames are likely to be compressed in the future, so not the next couple of years, and that's where Jerome's right, not till about 2020, 2021, but when things take off, boy, will they take off. And they'll take off not only as automated vehicles, but Internet of Things, that's connectivity, machine to talk, and this new ecology of mobility. So there's a lot happening out there at the same time, and it's all part of a big cycle of innovation. Now, I take you on the cycle, which really takes us today from automated or ADAS, driver assistance systems, into ride-hailing and ride-sharing, and then to full automated, and I call it domination, which is, you know, you just won't be allowed to get the keys to a car unless you really done significant driver training. And I've taken you on the vision there and a little bit of a time frame to understand what's in the back of my mind. Our industrial structure is already transforming around this, and I think, you know, moving into the sharing collaborative economies, we can develop what I call a new opportunity-rich economy. This is a really important slide. If there's only one slide that you remember about industry structure in Australia, this is how different. If you look on the far right-hand side, you'll see in Australia the number of startups, the percentage that we have as a percentage of total. It surprises most people to see that we have 50% more than the UK and the USA. And what I say in the text there is that actually startup companies were responsible in the last 10 years for all employment growth in Australia, all of it. So what we have is a distributed employment system, it's distributed employment growth, and that's why a distributed EV outcome makes enormous sense to a place like Australia.
Are there any sort of clusters where this is sort of happening in Australia that you can sort of point out?
Well, there are some clusters. I mean, and a good example of that would be Monash in Victoria, and North Ryde in Sydney. Macquarie Park's really interesting. It has got a rail that goes through it, but Macquarie Park's it's a lot larger than just where the stations are. So there are some very significant clusters. Northwest Business Park, Tally Ho, which is just sitting down the road from here. So yeah, this has been happening for a long time, and what tends to happen is that it always looks like the central cities are growing because that's what you see, and that's because that's where the public investment has been in cities. It hasn't been in the suburbs yet. So, but the actual employment locations are way more distributed.
I've got a great question here from Mark. I think it throws a bit of a curveball out there. How do we need? Why do we need any private ownership of driverless vehicles? Why not supply them as a government-owned fleet to ensure good public policy outcomes and avoid congestion and parking issues?
Well, that should be a scenario. There's just no doubt about it. I don't think we will need to own these motor vehicles. In fact, I think we will be paying for mobility as a service in the future, not necessarily as a capital amount, which I think would suit most people. Whether it's a government that owns the fleets or whether there's just a fleet of cars and you just get on the phone and you just dial up motor vehicle, and whichever motor vehicle's closest, depending on whichever company you want, and that's the vehicle that you actually use as a mobility service. In terms of government, there's some really interesting things happening in the States. Just share two things with you. Dollar buses. So these guys in Houston have taken to small buses, and they pull up at public bus stops, and they pick up people when buses aren't turning up, which is most of the time, so they're actually doing great trade. So first of all, no one's ever really thought this through, but also, yeah, absolutely. So people are beginning to think about mobility.
It's a great innovation there.
Absolutely, just in itself. Why couldn't we do that? We could do that today. And also the bus in WA in Perth, the AV bus that's been running in Perth, the RACWA, we had that discussion the other day, been running for 6 months now, very successfully on road. So look, the public sector needs and can have a major role. So industry structure, everything's pointing to the next slide, which is Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And so we have a big challenge. And one of the interesting parts of this challenge is that the policymakers, unfortunately for all you millennials listening to this, they're really old crusty boys and girls, and they really don't have a lot of buy-in to change, and they really can't understand, they think the system's the way it's going to be and we can't change anything. Well, talk to Bill Gates about that, or talk to Uber about that. And what we've got to do is we've got to help millennials, and we've got to help older policymakers know that we must take this leap of faith in Australia.
I think that's where I'll ask this question from Ian. Is it likely that commercial services will accept AV before the general public, e.g. couriers, deliveries, including fast food, etc.?
I think the answer to that's definitely, because there's commercial rationales. I mean, we've heard about these issues about, can we have pizza operations, for example, that actually don't own real estate that could disrupt Domino's because they only own vehicles and the vehicles continually are moving around on the road network. And these vehicles that move around, the commercial vehicles, they don't pay rates, they don't pay anything. You're allowed, you can stay on the road and move 24 hours a day, no tax. So the answer is yes. And I think we'll see the private sector driving this as hard as they can. And this is a major problem for us because public policy making does not see the urgency in creating a structure around controlling this. And we'll look back in 2025 and the system will be completely out of control. That's what I think. I'm pretty sure that I'm right. So we've talked about traffic congestion and AVs. The economic case, which is what everyone's actually online for, I'm going to get you to the end point at a point in time. But what I've suggested is that there's 4 ways you could look at things: market-led introduction, which is what's happening now; a community-based introduction, which is closer to the point that the questioner was asking before; an industry development introduction, which is 1+2, and stimulating investment in software; or a transformational introduction, which is what I'm talking about. And so today, what I'm presenting to you is a market-led introduction or number 4. I'm not doing 2 and 3, although they would be real alternatives. So the economic case: avoidable costs in Australia, that's in terms of safety and in terms of carbon and congestion. It's $80 billion baseline. So we can solve around $80 billion worth of problems. UK have estimated, grab this, $6 trillion in increased productivity and increased trade in the UK by the early introduction of AVs, and they are light years in front of us. So I've used some of their numbers because of that. And Canadian research suggests $65 billion in economic benefits. Now, just to put everybody in the picture, when at the peak of the car manufacturing here, the internal combustion engines, we were subsidising that industry to the tune of $2 million. So
2 million?
Two per annum, 2 million per annum. So 2 billion, so billion.
I'd say that's a good deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2 scenarios: minimum public intervention or let it rip, and a new mobility exit system. I say the second should be pursued, and that's to ensure that we don't get increased traffic congestion, to transition from car ownership to sharing, because I agree with that question. I don't think you need to own motor vehicles. Utilising AVs to maximise the efficiency of public transport and maximise active transport. Implementing a regulated asset base, and just for listeners, the idea there is that the Infrastructure Australia has suggested that major arterials or freeways be actually canvassed to be put into a corporatised entity which actually owns the major road systems. They own, operate and maintain. And I think that would be something that would be smart to do with the introduction of AVs, to make sure we've got the right infrastructures and we've got the right congestion charging, and devising a new approach to road freight movement and intermodal facilities to maximise efficiency. So what happens when we go to truck platooning and when we go to last mile delivery? How does that all work?
I guess that's a good question here from Chris. If we leave it up to the market, will we end up with, as a guess, 3 times the number of AVs on the road than we actually need?
That's an easy one. Yep. You will. And but it's not just about that. I think those benefits in active transport that we now understand, healthy cities, incredibly big. I mean, I'd hate to think that for 400 metres people are going to jump in an AV and go down to the local supermarket, and there'll be hundreds of AVs just hovering around the local supermarket. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I would anticipate.
A market failure.
Absolutely. And at the moment, because there's no vision of what happens with no change, everyone's a little bit wary, because everyone, and I think it runs something like this: if there's congestion charging, I'll have to pay more taxes, and particularly people who are lower down in the income chain. So what needs to happen is this new ecology of mobility needs to be put in a completely different framework, where there is no question that people at the lower end of the income chain are not paying more for their mobility. In fact, they should be paying less for mobility. And there are many ways to do this, but one of the interesting experiments has been again in the States, where Uber has actually replaced local buses because it's cheaper to Uber and rideshare. So the local authorities and the government's been paying Uber actually to replace buses. That's already happening. So this is all on. Private sector economic benefits, we've been through. Public sector economic benefits are huge, and I'll leave them for people to look at. And so really the direct economic impacts depend on the method of implementation and the nature of emerging supply chains and the actual infrastructure requirements. In other words, you can't measure what you can't specify. That's what that really means.
And I guess a question here from Monica again. So with the large-scale adoption of AVs, most of which will be EVs, what are your thoughts on peak power surge requirements, for example, as soon as people return home from work?
I think they'll be a little bit more distributed than that. That last piece of McKinsey work had a look at some of the peak power problems, and we actually have quite specific issues in Australia about peak power problems. I would suggest to you that within 10 years, that particularly with the wall technology and cube technology, that there will be options for much faster charging and for that to be done after midnight. I don't think you have to get home in the peak anymore, and I think the technology is going to look after that. Lots of indirect economic impacts, environmental impacts. There are the indirect, there's the impacts of the cost of new road traffic infrastructure, increased vehicles on the road, insurance and liability. So there's lots of things to begin to think about. But some things that aren't often thought about is the second last dot point, which is social inclusion in terms of mobility for the elderly, young and disabled. So in other words, it is very hard for those groups to move around, and it may well be that we'd be happy for an AV to be, I guess, to have passengers as young as 12, 13, 14 without an adult in the car, so long as it's, and there might be defined distances. So in other words, we solve the problem of how do you get to school if it's more than a kilometre, or for elderly people, that the trauma of losing your licence and being totally socially isolated absolutely goes away. That, as you know, that the experiment in Perth has been all about the elderly, and it's been incredibly popular for that AV bus to just keep running around, and it's the baby boomers have been really using it.
Yes, and as a safety counter then, I guess the other incentive becomes you're happy to give up your licence to get increased mobility, because all of a sudden the car's taking you around.
Absolutely, absolutely right. Just a very different way to think it through. And what it can also do is change people's attitudes to retirement living, and where you might, a good example of that would be many people are unwilling to move from their current large dwelling because they can't understand how they can continue to interact with their local friends network, their local church or pub or whatever. But with an AV, of course, that goes away. So huge potential sets of impacts. In terms of market penetration, if we looked at these are McKinsey graphs, and what they're looking at here is what they call the high disruption scenario and a low disruption scenario. And when we have a look at that high disruption, that just depends on the ride-sharing companies getting in early, and this is the accelerator theory. And you see the graph takes off much more quickly. But down the bottom, we see the low disruption scenario where where they say technical regulatory barriers and really commercial barriers. In other words, ride-hailing and ride-sharing doesn't reduce the cost of EV and AV, so there's no price advantage. And so if I look at the next graph, what you see there is that there are nowhere near as many benefits. If we look down to the 0, 20 and 40% there, it's not a lot of benefit in moving to in a private autonomy model. If you've got a situation, and 40% is the additional mobility, so if you get a 40% increase in mobility, which is possible, on current price elasticities, you should get about a 20% increase in total benefits. So you can see annual benefits per person in Australia would be only around about $400 a year by 2030 on their graph.
Well, and this is running, it's a good one here from Simon. So mobility as a service is now a reality in Helsinki with the WIM app.
Yep.
Users can pay a monthly fee for limitless use of multiple modes of transport. Do you think government has a role to play supporting mobility as a service and knitting transport modes, including AVs, together for the public?
Absolutely. Well, I was recently overseas and had discussions about that and the systems in Oslo as well, looking really at the EV, what the EV take up, and the government proactive policies, which is really helping to make that happen. And I would suggest to you that now that we don't have a car industry to lobby a government about innovation, why don't we get in there now and actually do this and make these very significant changes? It's really interesting that, and you can see it from the ADVI or our perspective, Jerome, where there's no industry structure left to lobby government. They've gone. So there's this huge void about, so who is it that really is pushing mobility other than international companies? Nobody. So that's why hopefully all those listening to myself and Jerome today are taking up the cudgel and saying, okay, are we getting it? These guys are really describing the gap.
Let's drive some change.
Absolutely right. Moody's had similar methodologies to mine. That's the ratings agency. They looked at the US, where there's 263 million automobiles, 11 and a half years average age. Our average age of vehicle here is about 10 and a half years. And they have about 18 million sales per annum. We have about, in terms of passenger and SUV, around 600,000 sales per annum. They think AVs will be a common option by 2030 and a majority of fleet by 2045, ubiquitous by 2055. My numbers are actually quite similar to that, but mine came out first, so therefore mine are correct. But there are a lot of barriers to take up, and what I've outlined here for everybody is what are the barriers, and really one barrier that doesn't get talked a lot about, but we're doing a lot at ADVI at the moment, is the driver, public and stakeholder perceptions. In other words, that human interaction with the vehicle, how does that actually really work? And there needs to still, we're a long way behind, aren't we, Jerome?
Oh, we are, and I think there's a lot of groups who are concerned about it, interest groups, what's it going to mean for their sort of sector. So I think that's one of the front and foremost things where ADVI's going to be trying to drive, doing demonstration trials and getting public perception change.
And there are many opportunities, not just passenger vehicles, but vehicle management systems, valet parking. There are so many opportunities here that we could, for example, a potential road user with epilepsy, there could be all kinds of things which are built for those kinds of people so that they've actually got some mobility. My own daughter, as a form of epilepsy, doesn't allow her to drive. There are a lot of people in the category. So, and we're on the cusp of having technologies which would actually allow that to happen. The McKinsey approach is really based on what I call a savings approach. How much money would you save by moving to AVs? Whereas my approach is more how much investment could we induce and how many more jobs would we actually be able to get. And they've used very standard price elasticities, which most transport planners on listening to this would know about, which really look at 10% decrease in car travel leading to a 4% increase in demand. And that would be a real problem if that actually occurred. So the Haratsis ADVI is based on, down the bottom, an industry development approach. Some of the things that are important are the estimation of jobs, and it's really looking at how and who owns the ADAS systems, where do they get built, and how is it that the operational framework actually works, where are all the lawyers in the transport commissions and insurances, and then really working through how it is we get to production and use of truly driverless cars. So I've had to make a whole lot of assumptions, which I have done. This is the one graph you've all been waiting for, or the answer to the question, which is when and what. And I think there'll be somewhere between 2016 and 2021 we won't see a lot of change. It's the Bill Gates theory, which we won't see a lot in the short run. By 2026, I still don't think there'll be a lot of autonomous vehicles, but the big changeover period will be 2026 to 2036. That's where I don't think it'll be the minimum scenario. I think it'll be the maximum scenario, and we'll have around about 30% of total vehicles being purchased, which would be autonomous. Now, that's the trigger point. Now, I'll ask you the question, Jerome. That gives us 20 years to invent an industry to cope with a mixed fleet, which is the first big issue, because we'll have a mixture on road. And then by 2036, we need to be absolutely in a position for the next 20-odd years, because you can see from 2036 to 2055, the market fundamentally alters in that. So we would actually have a new mobility system, maybe in your lifetime, maybe not in mine, but
I think you'll hold out, mate.
So it's imminent, and we really need to we actually need to be in a position by around 2021 to really understand what we're doing. 2017 next year, that's not much time at all. In fact, most planning scheme amendments take longer than that. Some of the important big numbers, I'll just take you to the bottom paragraph here. McKinsey forecast the automotive revenue pool could increase by 30% in the US to $1.5 trillion. So that question about will there be jobs? Well, they're forecasting more people spending more money on mobility, like another $500 billion per annum. And of course the UK, looking at the intelligent mobility markets, they're thinking that there would be another 1.2 trillion US dollars generated in the UK. So the export, in inverted commas, countries, unlike us, we may just be a pure importer and really not participate in the development of this industry, which would be a mistake. But most of the forecasters see very big dollars in industry development.
And I know we just heard all about the dollars quite a bit. We've got a question from Jeremy. What are the dynamics around the increase in EVs, Australia's climate change commitments, and could the aggressive introduction of AVs and the reduction in private car use really drive carbon reductions?
Well, the answer to that is you can, yes. One of the big, interesting numbers, and it's in the broader paper that I wrote, is that there's been a couple of discrete forecasts of with ride sharing. There is a view that if with effective ride sharing, 10% of the fleet, and let's just assume that they were EVs, but 10% of the fleet could actually perform 30% of the vehicle kilometres travelled. So 10% of the fleet. Now, so in other words, and that is an enormous impact on carbon. So McKinsey's talked a little bit about it, and I've read some other interesting stuff internationally, but ride sharing is the real, and ride hailing, they're the real big answers to be able to reduce the numbers of vehicles on the road, as well as having that fleet of cars which is not back to base, which is revolving the whole time.
Roving, yeah.
Absolutely. And the off current forecasting, we actually don't get to that big leap in the first hit. And you see off my numbers, we're only 30% of the fleet by 2036. So unless there was a mandated policy for EV and a mandated policy in terms of sharing and hailing, then we're going to hit serious problems by 2025, because traffic congestion will be intolerable in Melbourne and Sydney.
Do you think there's an appetite out there for anything, for that sort of level of intervention?
None. I think this is the next big, it shouldn't be a battle, it should be a collaborative innovation in Australia, because when you think about it, we're the lowest density developed country in the world. Of all the places in the world you'd want to confront the mobility issue, here Australia would be the #1 place.
Yes.
But it gets dragged down into the mire of congestion, tax, but the questions of equity and safety and those large savings just not on the agenda, which is why, and I know we're coming to a close, but why I've suggested that we really should be asking the Productivity Commission to help us to develop a new industry structure. In other words, a bit like the NDIS, where they developed one of the most innovative industry structures in the world. We should be asking for that, and asking, so if there's to be a new ecology of mobility, and I've actually defined the objectives that would, and the things that we would ask or could ask the Productivity Commission to do, so that we can actually have a debate, because at the moment we're actually not quite sure what we're debating.
Awesome. And Brian, just as we've got some audience questions sitting there, we could let them know that we'll write to them later. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome.
Yep.
So let's
power through.
Yeah, power through. Great job powering through, by the way.
No, it's good. It's been a lot of fun. So this new industry, managing change to maximise economic prosperity, has been the thematic that I've developed out of the work. And the approach is based on growing advanced manufacturing, new legal and insurance services, new communications and information technology value chains and innovations. I note that we have one of the best companies in the world, Coda, in South Australia, making V2X devices, which are being purchased internationally already. Integrated public and private transport, how do we do it? What's the focus? Equitable mobility, pricing, new revenue collection technologies, new city planning infrastructures, reducing overall costs of mobility, managing change to maximise active transport outcomes, and inventing what are called mobility monitoring systems. So there's a lot to do to manage a new industry. Dubai is actually having a run at it, and you can see there they're looking at savings of $22 billion or $8 billion in Australian dollars, and I think in Australia $10 billion is avoidable. And I also think, moving on, that in terms of the jobs, based on us achieving 1% of the global intelligence market, and by the way, we had a higher percentage of the world manufacturing market than that, we generate about $15 billion in revenue, around 7,500 direct, and 16,000 direct and indirect jobs, requiring around $1.5 to $2 billion. And would you believe it? That's about the amount of money we were putting into the old car industry. So with those dollars, that would be enough. And just to give this a little bit of context, 40,000 jobs are to be lost in Australia as a result of the withdrawal of the current industry, and that average public subsidy was $2 billion per annum. So this is not a big leap. This is just good, solid policy making. ADVI's got a couple of positions, and I would suggest that people have a look at them, but I just would summarise them. Firstly, that the Commonwealth Government should prepare and explore mechanisms to fund and manage the introduction of autonomous vehicles. And the first position, therefore, is a 5-year funding and incentive package. And secondly, that ADVI recommends as an immediate action an accelerated program to make things happen by 2020 to assist with remote parking, high-speed highway assist, and truck platooning. And at that point in time, I'm finished for the day. I don't know if there's any more questions, Jerome, but whether or not we should tie it up there.
I think we might be able to squeeze one more question. Are we done? Yep, we've got time for one more. So I do apologise for those we haven't had a chance to. We've been bombarded with a lot of questions, so we'll hold a lot of the other ones over.
And we will respond to them.
Oh, we will?
Yes.
So I guess here's a question from Damien, and I think this ties in some of the other papers you have up and coming. Is there anything from a road infrastructure perspective that needs to be installed, built to facilitate this AV future? It's a good one to finish on. Yeah, look, the answer is yes, there is. Some of these infrastructures, a good example would be how is it that we would move to mobility charging? Now, you won't see it on a road, but it's incredibly important that we actually work it through. How do we monitor in the future? How do we get the centre lines in the right locations? How is it that we invest the dollars in the road surfaces that if you're not driving or you're not looking at the road pavement, that the road pavement itself is actually in the right condition? So in other words, there are things that need to be done to make this system work that are different to the current system. In terms of the hard infrastructure itself, it's not really about building new roads, and I'm actually opposed at the moment to introducing new lanes for only AV. I think the mixed fleet should work as a mixed fleet, but I'd like to have more of an engineering debate about how that might work. So I don't think it's about building new roads, but there's a lot of detailing and infrastructure requirements that are going to be necessary to improve the safety outcomes. And I'll just finish with this little idea. And it was something that Jerome put into my head, that is the percentage of road deaths on rural roads. So what are we talking about? It's around about in Australia? I think in Victoria it's what, 50%? 50%, I thought it was 50%. 50%? That's right. And so far we've only talked urban. There would be significant, we would need to make sure that those roads were in the right condition to be able to take AV. Just as a matter of interest though, I did see the other day that Land Rover's been experimenting with four-wheel drive off-road AV. Well, being a country, I'm very keen to see AVs right into the country and help those people out as well. Yep, good stuff. Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Jerome. Thanks to the audience. They've been amazing, so engaging, so many great questions. Lots to think about and so many insights from Brian. Thanks so much for coming in.
The recording will be available as well after this, and it's free for everyone to watch at a time they see fit.
Awesome, and we'd like to ask our audience to complete the survey, which will launch shortly. Thank you.